The following program is a UW-TV classic.
From the University of Washington in Seattle, Upon Reflection.
Hello, and welcome to Upon Reflection. I'm Marcia Alvar. Colleen McElroy once described herself as a born storyteller whose love has always been language. A professor of English and creative writing teacher at the University of Washington, McElroy is also a prolific award-winning writer who works in a variety of forms: novels, short stories, television and stage plays, and most notably, poetry. A seasoned traveler, McElroy has taught and studied in countries from Yugoslavia to Malaysia, and in 1993 was awarded a Fulbright Fellowship to study the storytellers, myths, and customs of Madagascar. Welcome to Upon Reflection.
Thank you very much.
Tell me how this love affair with language began.
Oh, I suppose that it began somewhere when I was very young. And being an only child, my brother's 12 years younger, I spent a lot of time inventing things, inventing people and situations, and mimicking my mother and her sisters. My grandmother had, in the attic, had a full-length mirror and feather boas and big hats out of the turn of the century. And so I would take on the various parts of the women, not even knowing the language, the words that they used. I would mimic their intonations.
I read somewhere that you wanted to be an actress
Oh,
early
yes.
on, but didn't like the parts that you saw.
No. I'm afraid that in the middle of this 20th century, parts for black women were fairly limited, very limited. And I didn't want to pretend to be a maid or be a maid, so that ended acting. But I did work with radio for a while.
You were a talk show host.
Right, in television also. Right.
Now, you didn't write your first poem until you were in your 30s.
Right.
And what was where was your love affair with language going before then? What were you doing with it?
I was a speech pathologist, and I worked with people who were neurologically impaired, either because of an accident or a disease. They had lost the connection between what they were thinking or attempting to think and how they could express themselves. One of my patients described it as like being in a glass phone booth in the middle of a busy freeway. You have no coins, and the phone is there, but something's not working, and people keep zipping past you in their cars, and they're talking on phones, and they're talking to each other. And there you are in this wonderful phone booth, but you can't get out of it, nor can you signal that you're in it.
What an incredible image.
Mm-hmm.
And how did those experiences affect you as a writer? Did it give you more tools to work with when the writing began?
I'm sure it did. I think that language tends to be such a casual affair for people who can elicit words, and particularly for people who have gone to universities and who have done a lot of reading. The ability to conjure up a word, to elicit a word when you want it, to understand what is being said to you, tends to be a very casual affair. But when you work with someone who has only 2 or 3 words left, one of my patients had only the words "my wife," and he could communicate volumes with those 2 words. So for me, it was almost like going back to my grandmother's attic and the mirror, not knowing the words but using inflections, except in this case, I had to teach someone how to bypass that screwed up circuitry of neurological systems that had gone wrong and try to find some other words. He had 1 or 2 by the time he stopped being my patient. Basically, he relied on "my wife," and it would be "my wife, my wife, my wife, my wife, my wife, my wife."
What was going on with your own circuitry when that first poem popped out?
I suspect it was passionate. It was a very emotional kind of poem. My first poems were reminiscences, going back to my childhood, talking about my family, my mother's sisters, and how they taught me things without deliberately saying, this is what we're teaching you. But basically, I started writing poems because I went to poetry readings, and I heard people reading poems about black people in the U.S. and saying, this is what they're like, and I said, no, we're not. You're not even close to what it is. And although I knew my experiences had been shaped by very particular circumstances, there were stories I needed to tell. So I'm still a storyteller.
What was one of the early stories you felt you needed to tell?
When I was about 15, I decided, as many teenage girls decide, that my mother and I could not coexist in the same house. And it was a mutual agreement. And I went to an aunt's house, and she happened to be the one aunt who had not had any children. And I arrived about 2 weeks after another cousin from another sister's house. And by the time I left her house, a little over a year later, there were 5 or 6 cousins. One sort of floated in and out, living there. And so one of the first poems involved all of those girls living in the house of the childless aunt. And at the time, of course, I thought she was my savior. Now I have decided she was a saint. We were all about the same age. You know, we were all between 13 and 16. It must have been pure madness, but she managed quite well.
You were talking about the images that you were hearing about you and your people. I can't remember where I read it, but that it said something that black people in general and women in particular live in this space when they're defined from outside, and that it became part of your work as an artist to change that and to say life is more complicated, we're more complicated.
Exactly, exactly. And as I mature, shall I say mature instead of grow older, I find that I'm changing, I'm attempting to change how an older woman is defined. I don't know if we have definitions of older women. We have the young woman, we have the married woman, and then we have the very old woman. Well, people live between those two, and women live between those two, and they prosper between those 2 years. And so how do you define that? So many of my poems now involve how women are defined after a certain age.
You mentioned your early work. You did what many writers do. You worked with what you knew, your past. When I was reading your resume and your history, the word that came to me was motion, because you have done so much traveling. And I talked to a colleague of yours, a woman who's also a writer, and she said, most writers are willing to just work with the past, with what they know. But she said, Colleen is always reaching for new things. Is that what the travel is for you?
That's partly it. Partly because, again, back in those years when I was in my grandmother's attic, I knew that world had to be bigger than that attic. And I wanted to see what it was out there. My mother says to me, why are you always going to all those places? And I said, because they're there. So there's the curiosity, I want to see what's there, but also there's diaspora. Black people have been scattered around this globe, and what I learned in school did not help me understand that, because in textbooks, black people are either in Africa or they're in this country, and they are slaves or the products of slaves. So that's a very limited focus, and again, it's expanding the horizons.
We have some photographs that you took on your trip to Madagascar. Tell me why you chose that country.
Well, I originally chose that country because I read somewhere about one of their queens, Rana Valona, who had a choice of letting the missionaries in or not letting the missionaries in, and she misunderstood life ever after. And because I'm always fascinated by language and where it leads you, that story fascinated me. And then I discovered other things about the country, that it is, for example, the other side of the Middle Passage. We hear about the Middle Passage, and we hear about Mozambique, but we don't hear about what's on the other side. And that is a passage, that is a channel between the African continent and the island now known as Madagascar. So I was very interested in it.
The pictures we're going to look at are in three groups, and the first that we'll look at now is made up of storytellers. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What are we looking at?
These are young storytellers. The wonderful thing about being in Madagascar is that the oral tradition has not been lost, so that you find very young storytellers and very old ones at the same time. And the boy in the red shirt was just wonderful. Right now he's listening as the other boy tells a story. In the upper corner, the older man is also a storyteller. He was so much like a statue I have of an African griot. It was as if the statue had suddenly come to life. But as you can see, the children are around. I did not ask them to come sit. But they just came because oral tradition is still alive. It's still a part of the socialization process. And the little boy that's sitting next to him was his son, who's going to be a storyteller. Here are two storytellers. They are orators, which is different from the teller of tales. These orators make a connection between the ancestors and the living people of Madagascar, the living Malagasy citizens. And so this is a particular ceremony that's going on with the storytellers present. And I found many such ceremonies. Here is Daniel Stanislas, who was a wonderful storyteller, who told me stories in an atmosphere that was almost enchanted, because as he told them, the sun went down and the sky turned red and the water turned red, and it was almost as if I had been transported inside that story.
Just to look at a few of the storytellers of Madagascar as photographed by Colleen McElroy. Had you deliberately set out to focus on specific areas when you went to Madagascar?
Yes, I decided I wanted to look at those areas that were mostly African, Arab, Portuguese ancestry. But the capital in the highlands is also a part of that whole conglomerate. I mean, you can't separate out. And most of the people there are Malayo-Polynesian, so I got sort of an overlay of what kinds of stories are present.
And how all those cultures
and
are
how
intertwined.
all those cultures somehow influence each other.
We're going to look now at some slides of dancers.
Right. These are Sunday dances. They meet each Sunday in the capital and in other villages, and they perform ritual or ceremonial dances where, again, they call upon the ancestors. The iragasi, which is the way the dance is described, allows the storyteller to talk to the people about political situations, about social situations, how men and women should get along. So there's the men performing, and the men say to the women, you have to deal with your husbands in a better way. And then the women respond, wait, maybe you need to do something else.
It's a wonderful expression on their face.
Yes, so you get this exchange between the dancers and the audience too. Sometimes the audience sort of encourages dancers to say more about that particular subject.
And that call and response is all spontaneous?
Yes, yeah. The dances and the singers are, they perform memorized pieces, but the audience, of course, is more spontaneous about it. This is a young boy, and usually included in the ceremony, the ceremonial pattern, is a dance of the youth, and that dance also connects the ancestor to the present day. And those dancers are very wonderful. Here's a dance troupe from a mountain village, a highland village, and they performed, they came to see me. The others, I went to see them, but they came to see me at the bequest of the cultural minister. And they performed dances for me. Here is one of their dances, and it's about a shape changer, a mountain nymph who comes out of the lake and entices the prince. Of course, that's a very typical kind of story.
More of the pictures from Madagascar. One of the things I read that you said about travel is that you said when you travel, you look for echoes of yourself.
Yes, yes.
And what echoes of yourself did you find in Madagascar?
Well, first they thought I was Malagasy until I opened my mouth and they realized that I was not Malagasy. But I saw, of course, ways in which women are trained or educated or acculturated to accept their femaleness, to relate to children. Sometimes, as I've found in other countries, I would talk to a storyteller or to a poet, and though we were not speaking the same language, we had no need of a translator, because somehow we were talking about the same things in a different language. But you don't need but a few words in order to communicate. My wife will do if that's all you have.
This third set of pictures we're about to look at have to do with death rituals. And of course, in this country, we have very specific ways of looking at death. How different in Madagascar?
Well, this is Famadine, and it is a ceremony in which the living revisit the ancestors. And I don't think that you can equate funerals with Famadine. This particular one involved removing the bodies from a tomb and carrying them to a new site because the tomb was being repossessed by the owners of the grounds. But you have the entire family involved, and here you have people sitting on the ground holding each of the members of the family. The youngest child, the youngest generation, are the ones responsible for holding the ones who've been dead the longest, and so they were holding great-grandpa. They were having a great time because they weren't familiar with this person except as an ancestor. But as you get closer to the front, that person was holding her father, so it was more of a grieving process. Here they are about to rewrap the remains of a member of the family. And because the burial is almost like a mummification, you don't have the skeletal remains and all of this, you have a more of, it seems almost symbolic. I mean, it's obviously a body, but it's not that kind of gruesomeness. And then once they were at the new tomb site, each body was wrapped in an outer wrapping, and lined up so that the dancing could begin, the ceremony of the storyteller, again, telling about the lives of the ancestors, but also telling the ancestors what the family's been doing, and that some people weren't taking care of business. And then finally, to put the bodies back into the new tomb. Each member of the family had to participate in carrying their loved one around the tomb 3 times and then into their new home.
Tremendous intimacy in those pictures between the dead and the living.
Yes, yes, right.
Really striking for our culture where
Exactly.
we have
I was
such an
very
armed-
moved by it. I did not feel any sense of repulsion. It was a family gathering, and I can remember family gatherings in Missouri where some people weren't speaking to other people, and some people were saying, "Well, where have you been for the last 5 years? And we haven't heard from you. And what did you do there?" So it was very much a family gathering.
When you go around the world and you're gathering up these experiences, like we've just seen, you work in so many different forms as a writer. How do you know what's going to pop out?
I'm not sure. Sometimes my experiences become poems. Sometimes they become stories. Sometimes they're fragmented. In this case, they became photographs. All the photographs I took, I was so involved in the act of photographing events, and also in remembering all of those faces that seemed very familiar. They looked like people I knew. and being involved in the ceremonies and in the stories, so that they became photographs.
Your trip to Malaysia came out,
Right.
at least in part, as a poem, and I
Right.
wanted to see if you would share just a little piece of that poem with us now.
When I travel to warmer climates, I'm always struck by first the amount of color, the amount of motion, and how there just seems to be a rainbow of images that keep coming at me. And so this is part of it. During those first days of my visit to Malaysia, everything seemed to be in motion. The crowds, the smells, even the melody of languages, a dozen it seemed, syllables playing against each other in a canopy of sounds, and the sounds themselves played and replayed. Early in the morning, the ping-ping of bicycle bells began the day's deliveries of laundry, fresh produce, newspapers, and mail. Diesel-fueled buses fumed toward the center of the town, and trishaw drivers took up their posts along the main roads. Some trishaws carried their morning pickup of uniformed school children, some so small they occupied only the middle section of the narrow trishaw seat. Other trishaws ferried office workers or simply circled the block, pedaling slowly in front of buses and cars as they cruised for passengers.
You really get a sense of everything that's going on around you in that. Is that what poetry gives you?
Yes, yes. The images, the sounds of language allows me a way of developing the scene without saying, then I did this and then I did that. And, you know, it's not a diary, it's not an autobiography.
It's not linear.
Right. It's as close to visual, it's as close to cinematic as you can get.
I loved it. You described it once as, well, with poetry you could get your hands dirty.
Right, right. It's tactile.
Get in there and work with
because
the language.
when I write, I tend to use the spoken word as a part of the revision process. I read to myself, how does this sound? And sometimes as I am reading it, it feels good.
There are people who are voicing concern about the state of language, about the state of written language in particular. Several times, though, you've really celebrated the idea of the verbal tradition. And in this country, we seem to be seeing a renaissance of the verbal tradition and a real explosion in terms of poetry, performance poetry, slam poetry.
I think performance poetry certainly is growing. I don't think we will have the verbal tradition, the oral tradition, as it once existed, because I think technology has taken that spot. What we're doing now is oral tradition, except it's transformed somewhat by the presence of cameras and recording devices, and so you don't have audience participation.
Do you know why this is happening now? I mean, why is poetry all of a sudden seeming to show up everywhere?
I'm not sure. I tend to think that when there are rumblings of change, poetry tends to be more accessible than fiction. When there are periods of more stability and more reflection, then fiction seems to be more the mode.
So it's some kind of cultural bellwether.
I think so.
Do you see a different approach in language in your students? Do they look at language differently? Do they use it differently? Are they prepared differently?
Than students I've had earlier? Yes, certainly. I think that they are influenced more by what is outside, more by what they see on television and in the movies than what comes out of a book, what comes out of talking to each other, or sharing letters, for example. I think fewer students talk to me about having someone, whether they call it a pen pal or just a friend who's somewhere else, where they write long letters to this person.
When they have a cell phone, why write a letter?
Right, right.
Is that the biggest challenge you have as a teacher?
Yeah, that is the biggest challenge, but also it's the challenge of imagination. To tell them to close their eyes and then imagine, not to imagine by keeping the eyes open. And there's a slight difference, because if you're using only the visual, then you miss the other things. You miss the sounds and the tastes. It's impossible for movies, for example, to indicate how something smells, or what the texture of something is. And so they tend to rely too much on the visual.
I would think one of the biggest challenges for a writer is knowing when you're good, judging your own writing. Was there a moment when you knew that you were accomplished as a writer?
Only when I just finished something and it works. But each time I start a piece, there is that doubt. Can I do this? You know, is this Michael Ondiaje, who is a wonderful Canadian writer, has the title of a book, "The Trick with the Knife I'm Learning to Do." And so it's always this trick I'm learning to do as I begin each piece. But when I finish it, it's a high. You know, I'm so emotionally involved in it. I know this works, I'm good. But then there's the next one.
Then you have to start all over again. And what's ahead for you? What do you really have left to accomplish?
Well, I would love to have a body of work that represents what I've done in the last, since 1977, when I began to travel and to collect these stories. I'd love to have a body of work that represents those years. I'm working toward that. That's the first thing that I have on the agenda. And I want to see where I can make the move from where I've been to some other place. I'm still moving, I'm still traveling.
Still looking and
I'm
still searching.
Looking. When I came out of Madagascar, as I was as we were leaving Amsterdam, I turned to my partner and I said, "Have you ever been to New Zealand?"
And she's off again.
You're sick. You're not even home yet, and you're thinking about the next trip. And I said, you have to plan these things.
Well, next trip you take, come back and see us again.
I will.
Professor Colleen McElroy, thank you so much for being a guest.
Thank you.
To see more UWTV classics, visit uwtv.org/classics.